why don't we start first with you, Stephanie? Can you give us your perspective when you and I were talking about this at some length earlier. When we think about impact investing and thinking holistically, it is sometimes argued that we live in an age of excessive short-term thinking in capitalism. And even an Augusta group of fat cats as the Business Roundtable in Washington recently put out their desire for an end to quarterly guidance from companies because they believe short-term capitalism has been too much within the United States in that context. So there's clearly a lot of discussion about this. When you think about the question, what would be a way that holistic thinking could help address this? Give us an opening comment here.
Thanks, Vijay, and thanks to The Economist for hosting this event. It's
Sure.
fabulous. The way that we think about sustainable growth over time and holistic investing as an antidote to short-termism is really thinking about corporate value creation and everything that entails. Corporate value creation in terms of thinking about a strategy over a long time period, thinking about cash flow returns on invested capital, but then also thinking about the strategies that the company is meant to implement to really address some of these longer term issues and really sustain that competitive advantage for a long time period. And so whether you're thinking about governance, which of course is extremely important because the tone is set at the top in terms of strategies around climate or social issues, et cetera, or whether you're talking about environmental or social issues, these are issues that can significantly affect the return trajectory of companies over the long term, either through positive opportunities, new markets that are opening up, disruptive strategies that are disrupting different industries, but then also in terms of risk mitigation. And so we believe as investors that unless you incorporate these issues in your analysis of a company and its growth trajectory, you're missing part of the boat.
So you see it as part of your investment framework, really?
Yes.
Taking on board what some people might consider externalities or outside the framework of a narrowly defined definition of mandate.
That's correct. And as active investors across the capitalization spectrum and around the world, it's really important to understand what could drive that growth over the long term. And so that's why it's important that all of our investors that are evaluating companies from a fundamental basis are discussing these issues from both a return and a risk perspective at the same time that they're talking about corporate strategy and margin progression and earnings growth expectations. It's all part of the same discussion.
So we've had quite a sort of a to and fro today, starting with the opening debate, where there was a discussion about what should profit mean, going back to the dictionary. We had a sort of a broadening of the idea of what returns should be. We had a leader from Wall Street with her own set of funds now arguing that she doesn't want to be measured on returns, but rather on how individuals' own portfolio performs. And astonishingly to me, head of a fund rating agency pushing back, it sounded like, on metrics on stage. At least that's what I heard from Morningstar, which seemed extraordinary to me, given that's actually what they do, is entirely quantitative analysis and metrics. And so there's been a very interesting sort of line of argument and rethinking, and hopefully pushing us to think deeper about the issues, about what matters, what's measured, and are we capturing it with the ways we've done it to perhaps what might be looking for ways that are going forward. It looks like you're looking at a more, as you say, holistic or comprehensive way of doing it. Are you getting any pushback or challenges from within your own organization or from your clients as you push this, sort of promote this idea?
So we signed the UN Principles for Responsible Investing back in 2011 to really place a stake in the sand saying, we incorporate these holistically in what we do, even though previously it was kind of an unspoken activity. And we did get pushback, actually, in North America for a number of our institutional investors that said, wait a second, we want you to focus on returns. And we said, well, yes, we are focusing on returns, and these other factors are really important as understanding the strategy of an organization, as important as understanding how that company is going to execute on their financial plan. As important as understanding the competitive environment. And so that's abated now. In particular, our European clients are partnering with us and giving us feedback in this area. But I would say...
Why has it abated? Is it because you're posting those financial returns, or they're looking at regulation and seeing maybe a shifting in the regulatory market landscape? What's the reason that it's abated?
I think that thinking about these extra financial factors has become more mainstream, frankly. And while 25% of our assets are invested with some kind of exclusionary guideline, whether it's tobacco or alcohol or those kinds of things, more and more institutional investors are looking at ways that we can bolster returns through positive engagements and opening new markets. So I think that's a big change that we've had as well, in addition to generating strong results. I don't think it's either or, it's and.
Sure. Of course, we have to be mindful in talking about metrics and measurement that one can also end up with false precision, right? When we talk about measurement. And so I just want to put that cautionary note out there when we talk about what we measure and not getting a false confidence as well. So that requires human judgment, presumably, in all of this, right?
That's exactly right. And that's why it's important for our investment teams to meet with managements and engage with the companies, because it's one thing to have a policy, which is important because, again, the tone is set at the top. It's something entirely different on how that policy or how that viewpoint is internal to the organization overall, and if it's imprinted on everything that they do.
So we have specific case studies with two very interesting companies in different sectors represented. But before we delve into some of the details of your company's commitments and so on, do either of you want to join on board on this discussion about looking at the topic holistically and how you measure things, how you perhaps use this idea of looking beyond a specific financial metric, let's say, as a way of driving an organization or project? Do either of you have any examples or thoughts to share? I want to give you an opportunity there before we get into your specific company details.
So, as a non-finance guy, I'm going to go and crush through the thin ice I'm on. When you were asking the question, I was thinking about the holistic approach we're trying to do at AstraZeneca for what sustainability means. And just this past week, I was meeting with one of our lead scientists, and in the conversation, we were talking about clinical studies. And she was quite passionate about bringing the patient information to the forefront, and the importance of how the science has evolved over time, and that we're delivering better clinical studies and therefore better products for our patients who need them. And so I brought up the part about product environmental stewardship. And what I love about working with scientists is they're always out to disprove the original hypothesis they put out there. And she said, oh, environment's for someone else. I'm here for clinical studies. And she started talking back about patients. And I said, but what about the holistic view of the molecule that your team's looking at? Eventually it has to be in a container. Eventually it has to be shipped somewhere. And she said, I'm going to disprove what I just said. That's fascinating. What can we be doing differently? And so that's an example of we've started realizing that in our drug development process, we've been so focused on getting drugs to patients that we weren't taking the holistic approach about the totality of its impact once it got into the patient's hands and they were done with that. So now we're bringing it into phase one of our development, getting people to start thinking differently and sooner, because what you put a molecule in could potentially impact the integrity of that product, including if it's cold chain distribution or if it's a different way in which we could potentially be increasing the access to health care based on how we decide to develop that molecule into a medicine. So when you were talking about holistic, I can't give you a lot of the financial terms, but I can tell you to be successful and be a profitable company, the holistic thinking we're trying to bring in earlier for all of our employees throughout the drug development, operations, manufacturing, and commercialization of our products.
That is a really interesting example. When you started down that path, my initial instinct was the reflexive skepticism. Said, really, you're coming up with life-saving medicines, and you're going to, have a discussion about is it a paper or plastic? Come on, save that life. Come up with that breakthrough. Presumably, that's also what the scientist was initially thinking.
Yeah.
That's your mandate as a company. That's how you're rewarded. We want, as a society, we want you to come up with new medicines that save the world, hopefully at a lower price, of course, but
Absolutely.
nevertheless, that's for a different conversation. But your point about cold chain, of course, gets to thinking holistically. You could dramatically increase access, you could affect the environmental footprint, just by introducing that thought earlier on in the process. And so I thought that's such a great example of it. Probably too early to find any success yet, am I right? This is a recent conversation?
It's a recent conversation, but we do have individuals, scientists who work in different aspects of the business that just recently found a different blister pack for one of our cholesterol drugs that uses 30% less material, which is going to be saving us around $500,000 annually for that one individual line. And so now the challenge is, how do you replicate that across all the SKUs that we have available?
Right.
And that's in the operations commercialization side. So we have examples like that on a regular basis, but we're trying to go sooner.
Sure. Very interesting. Rasmus, a thought on this?
Yeah, if I can add something which maybe takes a different perspective here,
Sure.
one that is more of a global perspective. I think some of the challenges we're facing as a planet, the 2030 agenda, the Sustainable Development Goal agenda, I think in the words of Paul Pullman, which I think has been a great inspiration, is the business plan for the world. And I think it opens up massive market opportunities. There's an incredible investment gap. And if we are to progress this agenda as fast as we need to do, then it requires a combination of companies that can deliver on the targets. It requires vast investments, and it requires policymakers that provide frameworks that make this a good business case. Because if businesses don't deliver financial value, then they certainly won't deliver societal value.
Mm-hmm.
Let's stay with you for a moment. Since your company is a fascinating pivot that you're making, perhaps in this U.S. audience, not everyone knows the transition you're undergoing. Just in a nutshell, your firm used to be heavily committed to fossil fuels, and you're making quite a rapid pivot. Can you tell us very briefly what is the strategic shift and what are the targets you've taken on for yourself?
Yeah. So we were originally an oil and gas company that ran a bunch of coal-fired power stations. And today we're one of the most renewable, or one of the energy companies in Europe with the biggest concentration of renewable assets. We're also one of the most profitable ones. We're phasing out coal entirely by 2023. And by 2025, we'll be virtually carbon-free, providing green power to 30 million people.
And that's because of offsets. Just to be clear, are you still having
Thanks,
fossil
guys.
fuels and having offsets, or are you're divesting yourself by
No
2025
offsets.
completely?
So we divest-
Okay, well that certainly, I encourage you to, because that's a
Yeah.
much more ambitious
So
goal.
the oil and gas business was divested. The coal-fired power stations are being converted to running on sustainable biomass. We're the world leader in offshore wind, also with the portfolio in onshore wind and solar. So that's
So what-
and offshore wind is the main growth driver for our business.
Before we get to specifics of offshore wind, what was the impetus? What motivated? How much of it is the balance of, let's say, anticipating regulation or carbon pricing? Europe is clearly ahead on that compared to the United States. You are a Danish company, societal expectations. Give us a sense of why the company is doing this.
It was probably the perfect storm, the perfect combination of all of these things. About a decade ago, the EU came out with very ambitious renewable energy build-out targets that were implemented in the member countries. And at the same time, due to the financial crisis, our traditional revenue streams were dropping. And that really provided the impetus for the business to change and to seize that opportunity that we saw in renewable energy. And I think and it's actually an interesting way that stable frameworks provided by governments allowed us to mature a supply chain, mature operational efficiencies, promote technology development to a stage where the turbines are 5 times the size they were just a decade ago, with rotor spans larger than Colosseum today. These are massive machines. And I think if we want to, as a company, that was really what drove the impetus. And I think that's really an interesting case study in terms of creating these ambition loops, because now the price has dropped by more than 60% for offshore wind in a handful of years.
And am I right that you're actually doing zero subsidy project now in Germany related to this?
Correct.
Is that right?
Correct.
You can compete in the market.
We've been awarded projects at zero subsidy projects, zero subsidy prices, and now with the price in mature, or in many markets, being lower than new build coal and gas-fired power, then I think it's a total game changer. And you're seeing the same developments it's not just offshore wind, it's also solar and onshore wind.
But just to push a little bit on this, maybe we're at a point now where you can compete without subsidy, but surely subsidies were quite generous in Europe for various forms of renewables. What role did subsidies play versus what I heard you say, stable regulatory framework? Can you talk, which the US has not had in wind for many years, of course. Can you talk a little bit about the relative importance of both? Though I know you want to emphasize the no need for subsidies now, surely you would acknowledge that played a role in the transition.
Well, I think when you have a relatively immature technology that offshore wind was just a decade ago, it needs some sort of a push. And I think when you look at the time span over which the technology has matured to a stage where it's price competitive, I think that's incredibly interesting. And that has obviously been afforded through these regulatory frameworks that provided fixed pricing for a certain number of years. It provided stable outlooks for investors to come in. The model we have applied has been to build and divest 50% to bring in more cash to continue the growth. And it's been a means for us to bring in investors, but it's also been a means for us to tell our supply chains, listen, guys, there's actually a good business opportunity for you guys in this. And you should align your productions with an industry here that's really going to grow.
And so as an investor, as you think about that growth trajectory and you think about the role that those subsidies played in stabilizing the business and where it was going and what management was doing in order to really facilitate that margin progression and that growth, as an investor, it's intoxicating. And it's not intoxicating solely because it's offshore wind. It's intoxicating because of that growth trajectory. Right. And that's that holistic approach that I was talking about earlier.
Right. So you have an example clearly. And offshore wind, the economics were not promising 15, 20 years ago, or even a decade ago. Mm-hmm. So clearly, with still implicit subsidy baked in this tariff that you're getting, but it sounds like the certainty is what enabled the supply chains to mature, to get scale for a nascent industry. So we see how an ecosystem and taking a holistic approach can be nurtured over time. Right. We don't find this in the US for most things, I think. You invest obviously here too. Mm-hmm. Can you find an analog here or any hope here of finding a similar case study?
Well, I think that rather than thinking about it in terms of that holistic business shift within the US, one way that our teams have thought about environmental, social, and governance in the US is ways that the companies engage with their employees and their other constituents. And so back in the midst of the financial crisis, an example would be Old Dominion Freight Line, which obviously suffered significant decline in volumes and pricing in the midst of the financial crisis, as did the entire logistics industry. And one of the things that management did is they said, we are not going to cut our staff and we are not going to suspend our 401k contributions because from a business sense perspective, we want these employees to be engaged because the volume will come back and we're confident of it, and we have a social contract with our employees. That was in contrast to what other firms had done. And so you saw margins fall, although not as much as other logistics companies, and you saw volume and margins expand much more quickly when the economy rebounded. And so that's another way that we think about it. And it's funny, at the time, it wasn't called ESG. It was called managing a business properly. And so we can put a label on it now, but I think that's another example of how companies are including their values and the principles that they believe in and using it as a growth trajectory for them.
So picking up on that point about how you treat your own workforce as well as engaging them, Jim, I wanted to come to you. You have when I asked you, how do you get your fellow employees, the culture of your organization mobilized and moving in the direction you want it to go, you had an interesting answer: social media.
Yes.
So tell us a little bit about what that means and how that works at your company.
So one of the things, I've disclosed for those of you who haven't seen, I've been in sustainability for about 12 months. And prior to taking on the global role, I was thinking, it just feels like this is a soundbite. And so one of the big things I wanted to do was take it from soundbite to action. And we were quite proud of our employee engagement because we did a quarterly survey where we found that 92% of our employees knew what our sustainability agenda was, which is pretty remarkable. It was as strong as what our company mission is. But the first thing I did is I changed the question. And I said, I know in my role how I impact the global sustainability strategy. And we fell. We fell to about 78% because we were asking employees, how do you help achieve in the role in which you sit? Because for me, with the team of maybe 10 at the time, there's only so much we could do. Everyone kept saying that's what sustainability does. But I need to ignite 60,000. And so we brought in Workplace, which is Facebook at work. And we found that it unleashed what we called the open concept, where I sit next to the 61,000 employees we have around the world. And through their communities, we are able to, I hate to use this word, but it's the easiest one I can think of, dimensionalize, make it very tangible, what the material items are in our sustainability agenda.
So give us an example.
So, one specific example is around Green Fleet. And so, our fourth biggest contributor to our carbon footprint are the 18,000 vehicles we have driving around for our employees. And so I just put a challenge out there. How do we stop this? First region to come up with a solution, we started to engage. And it was interesting how it came about because first procurement got involved. Like, well, we own the contracts. And they said, but it's going to cost a little bit more. And an employee challenged and said, well, that doesn't make sense because we'd be spending less on gas. And like, oh, well, that's a different procurement professional. And so then once they brought it together, we realized that it wasn't an increase in total cost annually. And so we were able, in both the US and in Europe, to translate that into, we will be the first biopharmaceutical company in the US to be 100% hybrid by 2022. But it all started with just a challenge in social media internally to say, hey, what are some solutions we can have? So we have multiple examples of how we're able to come about. Just recently, I was one of 14 senior leaders responsible for our new corporate strategy, which if you're an investor, you'll be hearing more about over the next couple of weeks. But the one piece I want to talk about is I'm responsible for the third day of the senior leaders meeting, where we're talking about culture. And I was asked to do something around inclusion and diversity, a hot topic for all organizations and employee engagement. So here I sat, middle-aged white man, Western descent, representing all 17 dimensions of privilege for which the power structures benefit me, and I'm to talk about inclusion, and I was stuck. And then I had this random email from a colleague in International asking me to help them with the project. And it was over Workplace. And it triggered in me, the reason I got excited is because someone was asking me to be included in a decision. So I used that to do a 2-minute video in which I had over 100 responses from all functions within the organization and all 6 continents in which we operate, explaining why inclusion mattered to those employees. And so in less than 24 hours, I have one of the most impactful videos because I went to social media not to share I was proud of this or that, but to innovate and collaborate with people around the world, all working equally to push our mission, to push the boundaries of science, to deliver life-saving medicines, and contribute to the global sustainability agenda.
That's great. Yes, you want to jump in? I just want to ask the audience, please get your questions ready. We're going to come to you shortly. Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a perspective on this because when we changed the name 2 years ago, we also launched a new vision. A vision of a world that runs entirely on green energy. So we went from wanting to lead the green transformation to a call to action, not just to ourselves and our own employees, but to everybody, that we need to create a world that runs entirely on green energy because energy is the the main contributor to damaging the planet where we're living on. And I think one lesson, which I think is an interesting, or at least been interesting for me to experience, where I sit quite close to top management, but we're a much smaller operation than you are. But still, the 5,600 people, to get that vision to live really deep in the organization is a challenge that we're still struggling with. But it's really interesting to see now that when I come out and talk about the vision, what we're doing on sustainability, we're building renewable energy, we're doing it in a sustainable manner, how it really puts lights in their eyes. I had this guy who was close to retirement age come up to me the other day, say, "This is what's going to keep me for another 2 or 3 years in my workplace." And if you get your most brilliant, most experienced people staying there just a little longer, I think you can really harvest the fruits from that. And I've got I have people writing me emails almost on a weekly basis now with little things they want to do, projects where we have been really focused on the big transformation, buying components in a sustainable manner, etc. But the employees, they're extremely conscious about their own personal footprint related to their workplace. So as you say, you mentioned the vehicles, plastics, organic food, etc. So, and all of these little ideas they now have begun coming to me. But it's taken 2 years from when we made the name change. We launched the innovation. So it's worked really well externally. We're still sort of pushing it internally, but it's getting there now.
I think that's where
really
having that purpose is so important, because it allows you to attract and retain really talented individuals and provide that diversity of thought. And for any organization, whether you're an asset manager or a corporate that we're evaluating, that's extremely important in thinking about how those companies are going to grow and sustain that competitive advantage.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the secrets to Toyota's rise was, of course, its brilliance at harvesting the insights of the line worker and of every worker, which was not the way that the traditional assembly line factories in Detroit worked. And so you may have a blessing of too many good ideas. But it's better than the opposite, right? So let's see. Let's see if we have a couple of good questions from the audience. Who's going to have the courage to put up their hand? Let's have a good question for one of our panelists here. Maybe a show of hands will get you guys going. Okay, here we go. We have a table near the front. Let's have a microphone. It's just coming. 1 second. And as always, please identify yourself. And thank you for asking a question.
Hi, of course. Christine Michie. I'm with Axion, small business lender. So I've been formulating this during the day, so you just happen to be the ones because there was a moment and a call to ask. Do you think it's realistic to move towards a time where, when we think about risk and return, we're not worried about the investor's risk and the investor's return, but the investees, the social enterprise, the NGO, whatever it is that's going to be invested in? What further risk can they sustain? What reward do they need? What return will they produce? Can we make that switch, and how important is that for kind of integrating this into kind of our DNA as people, as investors?
Want to take that on, Stephanie?
I think it's an interesting question, and it kind of flips the whole industry on its head, really. I think from an asset management perspective, our view is that our purpose is to drive strong client outcomes. And those are millions of retirees that we invest on behalf of around the world, or nonprofits or other foundations and endowments that we're investing on behalf of to help them meet their missions. And so as an asset management firm, first and foremost, that's what we're focused on. I would say ancillarily, however, it's important to have that engagement from an industry perspective with other investors, but then also other organizations, other nonprofits, NGOs, et cetera, to think about ways and to iterate on ways that we can maybe achieve those aims in a broader sense. So from an asset management perspective, our purpose is first and foremost driving strong client outcomes, but all of these other conversations, I believe, can help inform the decisions that you're making and your investment process, frankly.
Yeah,
Anyone else?
I have very high expectations of the investment community. I mean, without funds, we're not going to change the world. Not going to achieve the targets that are there for a reason. So yeah, I think that's an interesting way of thinking, and I think it becomes really beautiful when you can drive societal impact while also making solid financial returns.
A question here?
Hi, Aisha D'Souza, African Leadership University. My question is for the gentleman from Ørsted. One of the big challenges is storage technologies in renewables. How have you addressed or solved it or are solving it?
So I wouldn't say we've solved that conundrum yet, and that's clearly the missing link in the transitioning to a 100% renewable world. I think we have plenty of space to still, or plenty of holes to fill with renewable energy before that becomes a really pertinent question. But nonetheless, it's something that we have to think about today. We're investing in storage as well, but what it's mainly being used for today is to support the power grid. So because now both production and consumption varies, it needs some sort of stabilizing factor, and batteries are extremely useful for that. So that's how they play a role today, but it's clear that in the longer term, we're going to need storage to be able to fully transition to a world that runs entirely on green energy.
Is the way that regulatory systems, grid operators reward storage or underpay for storage, is that part of the problem? Could you imagine a set of incentives that might motivate different behavior among energy companies and investors? Or do you think fundamentally that there's a technology gap, that we can't solve the problem just by throwing incentives at it?
It sounds like you know a little more about it than I do, but
you're
I
the
think it's
energy
clear
man.
to everybody that there is a technology gap,
Yeah.
for certain, and I think storage needs to go through a development process that resembles other renewable technologies such as solar, etc. It's simply the way that storage works today is you have a lot of iPhone batteries, you put them on top of each other, and you need to be a little more clever than that, I think.
All right. Another question from the floor? Yes, I see a hand here.
While we're waiting,
Yeah,
may
go
I
ahead.
come back to the...
Oh, sure, if you have a follow-up, please. 1 second. Yeah, go ahead.
So in full transparency, the question about, is it the investor-investee? I've been sitting here thinking a lot. One of my biggest concerns is the stakeholder of what I call employees. So a lot of the work that I've been doing, I'm a human behavioralist. So my graduate work was in organization development. I focused on accountability. And I've been seeing a major trend since the 2008 financial crisis, and one that many futurists are warning about today, and it's about human capital. And I ask you to remember the employees, that's you. It's the spouses, it's the partners, it's potentially your parents. Some of the trends we're talking about that I will see in my career is the potential, if life expectancy gets to 100, I might be working till I'm 75. But yet I'm seeing, especially within the US, a major gig economy taking place where workers are piecemealing their jobs and they may not have health insurance. It's a big issue in the EU right now with the unions. And as we're seeing this industrial revolution of technology, I know one of the things that we're really focused on are employees as stakeholders. One of the stats that stands out to me the most is a graduate in 1987 should expect their degree and what they learned to apply for 30 years. Someone graduating in 2017 should expect 18 to 24 months based on the rapidness of change that technology is bringing. So one thing that you can tell I'm quite passionate about is shifting the power structure to ensure that those people upon whom, last Friday I was chaperoning my son's field trip to the Baltimore Museum of Industry. And as a senior leader within a multinational conglomerate, it was striking to hear that at the turn of the century in Baltimore, they were worried about pay equity. They were worried about race issues. They were worried about water and environment. And I thought, we have an opportunity to figure this out because every single one of us dependable on this. So I have to come back to when you were talking about these different terms, people are going to be mattered. and they need to be at the forefront of the decisions you're making, and companies must be accountable for reskilling, retraining, and making sure they are a viable part of why we are so successful.
I do wonder, though, picking up on a phrase that you used, social contract, whether we need to revisit what is the social contract in societies for the 21st century, precisely because of the nature of work having shifted, longevity, our arrangements for retirement, even the basic question of what do we owe each other.
Yes.
I think, and it's not only business, this is a broader conversation, but of course, business and finance plays a role in this conversation. But yes, let's go on to our next question.
Hi, Emily Thomas with Morgan Stanley. I think one thing I'm seeing more demand around and more information coming out is on impact reporting. And I think you guys have shared a lot of really interesting stories and metrics that you guys are working on at your companies. How are you thinking about measuring those and then disclosing that to the ultimate investor?
Who wants to take
We're
it?
spending a lot of time on trying to get impact reporting right. And one of the things we're working on now is to link it with the Sustainable Development Goals, because that is the overall agenda set, I think, in this field. But it's very hard. I think we can do impact measurements pretty well in terms of our environmental footprint, less well in terms of our social footprint.
We're trying to figure it out. Right now, you'll see, I think it's March 6th, we're issuing our sustainability report, and we'll talk about the number of patients that we're reaching, the number of healthcare professionals that we're helping to educate. We primarily focus on SDG 3, 4, and 17, health and well-being, education, and partnerships. And Access to Medicine Index just recently came out, and they were saying that the big gap within industry is exactly that. Measurement and impact. And so and when we said, who's doing it best and what other things can we be leveraging, because we're open to learning and we know the importance of it, it's a gap. And so we're trying to figure it out. And if any of you have any suggestions, my contact information is in there. I specialize in accountability. Please hold me accountable, because I know it's important. It's not, I don't want sound bites. I want action, and I want something more than just, this is the number of patients. To me, that feels like pharma last century. We know the number of patients because this is how many pills we sold. The average therapy is this. We're hoping that we can start having an impact on disease prevention. It's the only way that we can have a sustainable economy. When you look at India, for example, by 2030, they're going to double in diabetes based on what's being consumed. We can prevent diabetes. These non-communicable diseases, the leading cause of death, these things are preventable, so we have to start addressing those. And I would like to see some of those being held accountable for healthcare organizations.
I mean, actually, just to pick up on your point, it's been pointed out that emerging economies now have a double burden of both the infectious diseases as well as these non-communicable diseases. India is a good example, but others too. What role do you think the industry should play, broader than just one company's actions? Is there something that needs to be taken up more vigorously?
Yes. Some of the programs we're doing, working with the World Health Organization, they have the 5 social determinants of a healthy life: diet, smoking cessation, responsible alcohol, safe sexual practices, and movement. So we have a young health program in more than 20 of our markets. One focus area is in Indonesia. I was working with some of our colleagues there, and the fastest growing population of smokers are 9 to 14-year-old males, my son's ages. And so that's unacceptable. And so, what type of education are we bringing into the school systems? And, I hear this all the time, oh, come on, you want that. I really don't. Because what's happening is the economy cannot sustain that. And so as an innovative, non-communicable disease biopharma company, that's not a sustainable model to continue to be having patients come into these disease states that naturally will start to occur as you age. Cancer finds its way, respiratory diseases finds its way. So it will put us out of business if we don't take the science. I always, when I talk to my scientists, you study disease to come up with the cure. We have an obligation to share this part of our business as well. And so that's where I think healthcare companies can really start coming. And we have more you'll hear about, at a different time. I don't want to take up, but we're doing respiratory prevention in Africa now with portable biodigesters, trying to change cooking for your family with hard source fuels should not be contributing to 15% of the respiratory disease in low to middle income.
Is the indoor pollution scourge.
Yeah.
Right.
So it was interesting, before we came on, you were telling me how many people are on your sustainability team across the world.
So we have approximately 220 employees working.
Which is fabulous. I mean, it's embedded in the entire company. I think the challenge I see from a company perspective, though, is in those small companies where they're just growing so fast and they don't have 220 or 200 or 10 people that can actually measure. And so while the incentive to measure is good and important, it's really more trying to understand what the action is around it. And that's where having that engagement on an ongoing basis to understand not just the intent, but the activity is important.
Just added, what's been inspiring for me in measuring impacts is taking a context-based perspective. So for instance, setting a carbon emission reduction target aligned with science. And we joined last year something called the Future Fit Business Benchmark, which takes a planet or applies a planetary boundary perspective on environmental and social matters. So, and the purpose is really to bring measurements out of the we're comparing this year's performance with our own past year's performance, which doesn't really say anything. You have a 10% decrease of something, but who cares? I mean, it doesn't tell anything about the real impact of it. So putting it into a context, a societal context, I think that's the way to go for us. And the Future Fit Business Benchmark, I think, seems to be a really interesting way to do that.
Let's go for another question from the floor. We have probably time for, I see a hand over there. Yes.
Hi, April Rudin, the Rudin Group, financial services marketing firm. I just want to ask a really basic question of this panel, one that I often think of it at times like this. We talked about content, we talked about context, and I am staring at investing for impact and listening to all of you talk about impact, sustainability, and so on. How can we have a conversation when, is there a universal definition of what these words mean? And maybe the panel can talk a little bit about what really is impact, what is sustainability, and what does some of these things mean? Before we can measure them, can we agree on sort of a universal definition? Because I think the nomenclature and the words really matter.
I think that's an important point. But again, I also think that it is such a wide array depending upon your perspective and your starting point. And so the way that I think about impact is, and the definition really being that having a significant effect on something and someone. And so the way that I think about impact is the way that you as a firm behave towards your clients, towards your employees, and towards the industry overall. And so first and foremost, our most significant positive impact is on driving strong results for clients and our ultimate end clients. And environmental, social, and governance for us is a cohesive part of that strategy. We also think about impact in the communities that we serve and our engagement with our employees and our educational assistance and job training and things like that as well, because obviously having an engaged employee base is extremely important, and those relationships are the most important to drive results. And so I think about it holistically, and I think it also has to be authentic in terms of tying back to your values. And so from that perspective, I don't know that it has a common definition. But what I do know is that it really has a focus on the long term. It means treating people the way that you want to be treated. and it means thinking about the future and the future generations.
If I could just add briefly, I share some of the unease that the questioner has with the squishiness of some of our conversation today and generally in this field. But I think that the old paradigm, the Milton Friedman paradigm of the business of business is business, which you heard a little bit of an echo from our former SEC commissioner who was on stage, where he talked about the law and what is the fiduciary duty of investment managers. The law was written at a time when that was the thinking. But I think, as we've argued on our leader pages, that the expectations of business are evolving, as indeed it becomes clear, for example, among other things, what time frame are we talking about returns? Is it quarterly? Are we talking, if we talk a broader view about longer term, then immediately you might make slightly different decisions. You might take account of different kinds of investments that are still selfishly in the interests of your company or your investor base. And so then it gets harder, right? And it's right to hold people to task, especially when you give them or your parents' retirement money. It is right that we ask the hard questions. But I'm also grateful that we are having some smart people thinking about and experimenting and innovating and pushing us to go beyond what was perhaps yesterday's paradigm. Because the challenges that lie ahead are great. So we're going to have to come up with some better solutions, I would put to you.